Hi, everyone. Well, welcome to our first Root of a session for 2021. Hope everyone is staying safe during the pandemic, and I'm so happy to have you with us today. I have a really special guest with us today. I love it when I have guests that really need no introduction, but today we have Jim Schweigert, president of Gro Alliance, also the second vice chair of ASTA, and most recently, and the one that I'm proudest to call our latest sport advisor. Jim, welcome to the Root of It.
Thanks for having me.
Jim, if you don't mind, for the audience members that may not be familiar with Grow Alliance, would you mind just giving a quick 30-second introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. So Gro Alliance is a seed supply solutions company, family owned, founded in 1941. And really, we're kind of basic in custom breeding crops all the way through finished seed production and ultimately then even custom distribution to the farmer. So when you think about the entire seed supply chain from breeding through customer sales and ultimately to what the farmer plants, we sit in the middle everywhere from the breeding side. So companies will bring us IP. We execute those field nursery projects for them, take that all the way through finished seed production through our network of growers and facilities to produce the finished product that a farmer ultimately plants. And then we make sure it gets to the right farmers too for companies.
Excellent. And Jim, just for the audience, that's kind of how our relationship came together last year. I think it was really interesting because when we put on the first Root of It series, it kind of became art imitates reality because we were trying to deconstruct agriculture and seeing if we could possibly create a better supply chain for our products, photo seed specifically. And that's when our conversation kind of started and about the partnership with Grow Alliance that was recently announced. And I remember during that whole period, what really inspired us to kind of take that leap to the next step about creating our new type of agriculture system was exactly what you said was there is a better way and there are options out there for innovation companies to start delivering their own products to market. And for today's series, I kind of want to dive into that a little bit deeper from the grower perspective. So today's root of it is called Innovating for Today's Growers. And I thought I would start out by kind of giving a little bit of context and setting, which is we're kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. I'm 2 weeks fully vaccinated, and COVID is kind of going to be passing us by, hopefully, and things are getting back to normal. But the other kind of light at the end of the tunnel that we're seeing is that commodity prices are rebounding. And we've been in this commodity glut now for 10 years plus. And Jim, you work so closely with growers across the Corn Belt. What would you say is the psychology of growers today, seeing kind of this hopeful future of commodity prices, seeing our economy get back on its feet? What's just the general pulse of it?
Yeah, grower attitudes right now are really strong. They're excited about the finish to last year's crop where they saw a big rise at the end. So any grain that was unpriced, farmers really took advantage of that at the end of the 2020 season. And right now they've got opportunities to lock in pretty high margin levels if they sell their grain. Unfortunately, some of the input costs have rose pretty quickly here,
Mhm.
especially around fertilizer prices lately have kind of eaten into some of those margins. But overall,
Mhm.
I think it's pretty optimistic for that commodity grain farmer. There are some washouts though. I mean, we still have to have a really good demand throughout the entire season to utilize the crop at the rates that kind of the market is expecting. But overall, growers are excited, they're happy, and they're getting back in the fields, and they're very happy that COVID is getting quickly to be in the rearview mirror. Agriculture was a essential industry in a lot of different states, so they were higher up on the vaccine priority list, and so a lot of farmers have been vaccinated, and they're excited to get to it.
Perfect. Well, Jim, you kind of mentioned that, grower optimism is there, but this is one in the series of boom bust cycles that for some of our more experienced farmers, they've seen this before. Would you say that this down cycle felt different in any way, either in terms of how quickly it came on, how severe it was, or how long it lasted?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because you might just look back at 2020 and say, that was the down period. But you can go back almost 10 years and you've been in a commodity trough, as I kind of call it. You've had very good years of production. The market's been very comfortable having a constant supply of corn and soybeans
Mhm.
globally. I mean, there hasn't been major disruptions like we saw back in 2011 and 2012.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of put commodities in a range where there isn't that boom cycle, not necessarily a bust, but it's really put pressure on margins. And through that entire time, the whole supply chain has been kind of trying to get used to that constant and consistent low margin business. So my hope is that as commodity prices have risen here, farmers don't forget the lessons that they learned when the prices were low, and that they continue to move on some of the opportunities that they've identified to diversify their farm. Don't get back into the mentality of, hey, the prices are high, let's go back to corn soy, let's go back to what I've always done, which ultimately leads them back to another bust cycle. So my hope is that the trough was low enough and long enough that people had the opportunity to really innovate and think about their business differently, and that can propel them into bigger things in the future.
Yeah, Jim, I was shocked when I read some of the extension reports that were coming out across the Corn Belt, and they were saying that, for farm incomes to be in the black, something like the average yield of corn and soy had to be like 10 to 20 bushels above. And this was soybean specifically, but it was like 10 to 20 bushels above what the state average was. So that means at least, 50% of farmers were losing money with where commodity prices were. And those margins were razor thin. And you're right, because I think the nice thing, if you can call it that, were the one silver lining of the pandemic, and I talk about this a lot, is it gave us a chance to kind of pause, stop, and reevaluate everything, personally and professionally. Like, I haven't been to a barber in 18 months. These are now all, home haircuts, make my own coffee. So just in terms of how I think about my spending, what is core to just the everyday life, like all that has changed. Do you think growers are ready to do that beyond their personal lives in terms of um, how they're thinking about their operations? Because you mentioned that margins are good right now, but prices are rising. It seems like the farmer is going to get squeezed again. And there's a great quote from our late chairman, Jerry. He said, farming is the toughest industry in the world. It's the only segment where you pay retail, sell wholesale, and pay freight both ways.
Right.
And so we talk about taking care of the farmer, but the system really isn't set up to do that, with the way that our entire supply chain is set up. So what are farmers looking for? I mean, do you see that culture shift where everything's being reevaluated? What are some of the areas that you feel like growers are saying this is not working and we want to change how we operate?
On the farmer side, it's interesting because, those that took that opportunity to really look under the hood and their farming operations, and and then those who said, okay, what does it look like without government subsidies? Because a
Mhm.
lot of things got covered up with, government payments to support price declines from the trade war, and then also the COVID payments. But if you really pop that hood on a lot of farms, almost all of the gain in their equity has just been in land appreciation, and most farms are break even at best. And so it really takes farmers to kind of step back from maybe just that bottom line, or thinking about their business the way it is, to think about what it actually is, and as that middleman, who just doesn't get to keep a lot of the value that's being generated. And amazing new technologies have been brought into farming. There's a lot of companies trying to, quote, help the farmer, but at the end of the day, the farmer situation doesn't improve a whole lot over time,
Hmm.
especially when you remove the subsidy piece. And so I think net farm income had, my number might not be right, but I think it was like 30-40% of net farm income in 2020 was direct government subsidy payments. So even at the end of that year, a farm might say, hey, I did pretty well in 2020. If they take everything out of their business that's kind of temporary support and look at just the nuts and bolts, that straight commodity production business is really, really difficult to be profitable in.
And Jim, if we could shift gears, because you talked a lot about policy and the trade wars, and I want to take this conversation maybe up a level. And again, I don't want to sound protectionist, isolationist, or even xenophobic, but I really feel like the US gets the short end of the stick when it comes to global agriculture and commodities, like you said. Our farmers are local, right? Like they have to feed their families. It's about the communities they live in, yet they're so subject to the whims of what's happening internationally, often used as a bargaining chip. And even from where we're sitting as innovators, we feel that as well. And I'll give you a great example. The US is probably the most productive, the most efficient, and the most innovative agricultural country in the world. Yet the timelines and the cost for innovation to reach farmers is protracted because of the fact that often farmers deal with a global commodity system. We worry about every single country in the world who often use either trade barriers or regulatory barriers to protect their domestic industries, which then in turn prevents great products from reaching US farmers and more importantly the US value chain as quickly as possible. And it really feels like, that the US farmer, despite being a market leader and innovation leader, we're kind of reduced to the lowest common denominator of what is possible. And again, I think we have a moral mission to feed the world. Every farmer feels like that. And, US farming is truly the backbone, I think, of global nutrition and food. But the current system in my mind just isn't working from a policy standpoint. I think there's innovations out there that could be readily available from a science standpoint, but large companies, because of their kind of global mandate footprints, business models, those technologies just simply don't get attention that's needed because they don't cover that global scale or is acceptable to policymakers in Beijing or Paris. How can we kind of move away from this? What would you want to tell policymakers as farmers to say, just beyond trade in general, but how can we accelerate innovation so that we're taking care of local producers, our local value chain, and everyone that produces food here in the US? Soy and corn, half of that doesn't go internationally. Half of that is right here helping our economy today.
Yeah, you brought up some really great points, and you take the example of the timelines for GMO trade approvals in the late 1990s. That was pretty predictable. Things went according to a fairly regular schedule. And then as time went on, countries around the world that had different stances on GMO technology started to put up these non tariff trade barriers to block US exports of commodity grain into their country, essentially to support their own domestic industry and give them a better competitive footprint against the US farmer. The side effect of that has now been the incredible delay in regulatory approvals for GMO products that are going into a general export market.
Mhm.
It used to be that US farmers had to wait on maybe just a few countries to make to do the approval. Well, now the list continues to grow and get bigger and broader and wider. And as the US exports more commodity grain to more countries, that list is just going to get increased. That means now you have to check off the box in, 2 dozen countries instead of maybe 10. And a lot of those countries don't have the same type of regulatory infrastructure to even go through the science based approval process. Some of those use that as a barrier for US grain, and the farmers don't get access to the technology. So the response in the industry has seemed to be we're going to look for different ways to innovate and maybe not bring forward all of our best products because now we have this 10-year time gap. My perspective is you need to disconnect from that system. You can't stop the pace of innovation because some country may or may not accept it and you might have to wait 10 years. Build your own value added system here in the US because, as you said, we consume a huge amount of grain in the US. We're not as interconnected in the export market as a lot of other countries, especially places like Canada, who don't have the population to consume that really has to export all that. We can build closed loop systems of innovative products in the US and give all the control to the US companies doing the research and innovation, all the access to US farmers that want to use that product, build the right type of distribution system, so you can keep that identity preserved, keep it in a separate tight channel, and get that product to end users. I think definitely is an opportunity in the future.
That's great, Jim. And for 'cause what you said earlier is that farmers are looking for margins, right? And farmers are looking for differentiation. But by definition, it's impossible to differentiate in a global commodity market. I mean, when you look at the current industry right now, is there a lot of data that shows that farmers have chosen to produce specifically for an end user on whatever dimension, whether it's quality, certified organic, non-GMO, whatever it may be? Have those farmers done better? And have you seen that those supply chains seem to be pretty robust and segmented? Because we don't hear a lot about that. I think when you talk with major industry, they were saying, "Oh gosh, we're running 100 miles an hour and we can't change." But are those proven examples already out there?
Yeah, there definitely are some proven examples where those niche market opportunities create more value for the farmer. Organic is kind of interesting because those margins have tailed off a little bit here the last couple of years because a lot of additional bigger players have gotten in, trying to scale up acres, essentially trying to turn it back into a commodity product and pull the margins out from farmers. So commodity
Wow.
grain price of organic corn has fallen the last 2 years quite a bit, and you kind of have this industrialization of organic, which means now more broad footprint, so less margin in for the farmer and more margin taken out by the supply chain. I think that's always the rub is the supply chain wants to keep the margin for itself.
Mhm.
Anytime that grain is moving, they get a cut of that, and they don't like those independent IP systems. But for farmers and for innovators and for those who can participate in that closed loop, there's a lot of opportunity to really share that within each other, and build up those kind of community-based agricultural systems that deliver an end-use product that consumers want to buy, a better quality product than just buying yield. And one of the things I like to say is cows and pigs don't eat yield. They eat oil, they eat protein, but the farmers don't get paid for any of that. They just get paid for the weight. And so there's this big disconnect between what you're actually trying to make, which is nutrition for animals, or something that produces more ethanol. You're trying to make an output, but everybody's incentivized on just making a bigger pile of the cheapest, heaviest product.
Yep.
Those aren't connected. And that disconnect creates the opportunity for all these intermediaries to take a piece of what they want and leave little for the farmer, and definitely not pay the premium quality
Mhm.
farmers for the quality of the product they produce.
Jim, that's so fascinating because I think you've pointed out, I guess, an interesting dichotomy, which is we talk about razor thin margins and we hear that a lot. But what you're actually saying is that the supply chain has a lot of fat in it, excess fat that's taking away margins from who's really critical, the people that's producing our grain. And at ZeaKal, that we're very passionate about changing that system. We call it the new type ag model, which is trying to create a new ag system. But for the listeners today, you mentioned the middleman. You talked about everyone taking a slice of this. I want to maybe shift the conversation to maybe the supply chain specifically and a little bit about the business model. So we talk about how ag needs to be digitized, revolutionized, that it's the last and oldest industry to still need to get disrupted. Um, I always talk about using, kind of a cliche example. Can ag kind of become like the Walmart or Amazon, right? Like ag still feels like the strip malls. We're still
Mhm.
having a lot of, infrastructure, brick and mortar, large sales forces. Not much of that is digitized and not much of that is direct to farmers. How critical is that? Because I look at what Walmart did, two very simple changes. Strip out the packaging so that you have more shelf space and make sure that no truck is ever empty on a delivery that's always picking something up. Two really simple innovations like that drove down costs and those benefits were passed on to the consumer. Amazon, nothing novel about what they sell, but they kind of stripped out the idea that you need a physical space. What are the areas like that in ag that you look at as just pure fat rather than value add?
Yeah, I think those are two interesting examples. I saw one kind of quote about Airbnb, one of the largest hotel chains in the world, and it has doesn't own any hotels. And I think we I wrote an article for Seed World magazine about this, but we still sell seed and we still do a lot of things in agriculture like my grandpa did in 1941. And we have a lot of inertia in the seed side of the business, and a lot of models that are very well established, and there's a lot of reliance and kind of interconnectivity between those, and they don't want to give up their cut at every one of those stages, the kind of hierarchy of sales and dealers and retail locations, and all the channels that something has to go through before it gets to a farmer, kind of on the input side, and then in the output side, all those same channels that a bushel of grain has to go to before it gets to a miller who's going to use it in a food product. And the farmer really is in control of any of those. They're the ultimate buyer of all of those inputs. They don't have much of a say in it. They're the ultimate producer of all the output, but they don't get a say in where it goes or how it's marketed or really how it's sold. And everybody around them is dictating all the terms of the relationship. And it's just kind of an upside down model,
Right.
built for those companies, and they don't really have an incentive to change. It's going to take, I think, innovative and creative thoughts and something new to really disrupt that.
No, that's really interesting, Jim. You made a point to say that farmers really have no say in what they're buying, but obviously the machine, the wheel have to keep turning. We have to keep producing food. When farmers look at their choices right now for innovation, crop inputs, digital strategies, seed, especially, do farmers really feel like that they have choices? Are the choices really that differentiated? Or does it kind of feel like our internet plans where it's kind of where you live and you have one of the majors to supply it? And if you don't like the customer service, well, too bad, buy a new house. I mean, that's kind of how it is here in California. I
Right.
mean, do farmers really feel like that there's different choices? And what's working for them? What's working about this current system as it is, and what's not working?
Farmers, where farmers have choice and where they don't is a really interesting kind of thing to kind of break out, because there are a lot of different seed companies that sell a wide range of germplasm. But at the end of the day, the farmer is really buying corn to turn into commercial commodity grain.
Mhm.
So even though you have, you can buy from a lot of different seed companies, you can get different GMO traits, you can buy conventional, something like that. At the end of the day, you're still buying a product that has an ultimate goal of making you just number two yellow commodity corn. And so it probably feels like farmers have a ton of choices, and within a narrow band, they do. But especially in the Midwest, you have two crop options. You can grow corn for commodity, you can grow soybeans for commodity.
Mhm.
And you're subject to the whims of the entire global um, agricultural commodity complex to decide if you're going to go, 60% corn or 40% corn.
Mhm.
That's kind of the only real range that farmers have to choose from. Now, because you have a lot of brands to pick from, it kind of looks like there's a lot of choices, and you can buy from a lot of seed companies. But ultimately, you're buying either corn or you're buying soybeans, and you're turning it into a commodity product. And you don't get to decide what the price is, other than within, again, a narrow band. Commodity market goes up or down, but within that band, maybe 15 to 20%, that's where you get to make your choices. And so when you really start to break it down and say, what do they control and what they buy? What do they control and what they sell? It can feel like there's a lot when you talk about all the brands they can buy from. And boy, the commodity price has really been moving up and down a lot. Sure. But let's actually break that down. How much does the commodity price move in the last 10 years? Take the high and the low. It's a fairly narrow band, other than maybe a spike here or there. And
Mhm.
then on what they're buying, it's corn to make commercial grain from. So Yeah, I think there's definitely opportunities to innovate there, give farmers options to produce something for more value added markets that give them some more choices.
So, Jim, it sounds to me like the takeaway is if farmers, in one word, is how can we insulate them from commodity markets? How can we make everything a little bit more local, a little bit more focused so that they're dealing with maybe an end user that values what they're actually producing in a different way? And that's the only market that they care about. And that's the only thing that they care about what's in their bin, rather than believing that what's in their bin is the same as everyone else's around the world. And it's a faceless buyer that they will never actually get to work with, right?
Yeah, and you kind of asked like how why does the wheel keep turning if it's been like this for so long?
Right.
Why are we still on the same wagon? And basically, it's because the whole system is pretty smart. They know where the margins are. They know how they're extracted, and they're always working to make sure the system stays in place. So there's just enough margin for the farmers to continue to grow, to continue to stay on their farm and advance their business, all while the whole consolidation piece is in the background, kind of working to drive more efficiency. So the system is smart enough to keep it in balance, but it's definitely not giving farmers that opportunity to really break through and to get kind of paid relative to their ability to outperform the neighbor. They just don't get much opportunity for that today.
Wow. That is that is a shocking revelation, Jim.
Well, it's tough. I mean, they have such a narrow band in which they can operate because they don't control either end of the supply chain and aren't typically involved in the supply chain. So I think if you look at all, I mean, there's probably a lot of other supply chain examples that are that same way. Just happen to really
Mhm.
understand the one in ag because that's what I operate in. But yeah, I mean, it's just kind of squeezed from both directions, and um, it's perfected over a number of years, and it yeah, they're kind of are where they are.
Well, the optimist in me wants to believe that when people say they want change, that I want to give them at least the benefit of a doubt, because I've heard from the value chain that change is needed and that processors want, better margins, and users definitely want a better quality product. Like you said at the beginning, they don't buy on bushels, they care about oil, protein, carbohydrates. What's preventing this from changing, Jim? I mean, we in our first session last year, we kind of talked about, can we repurpose or do we have to tear it down? Is it just too hard to make these incremental changes? It's just so stagnant at the core that you can't go around the edges, that you need someone to come in, kind of tabula rasa and just clean slate and just redo this. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting, and I was kind of reflecting on this whole consumer. They're shifting preferences, and most of my conversations with companies in agriculture has been one of or the industry is kind of frustrated or challenged by the fact that consumers are changing their minds so quickly, and the system isn't able to keep up and react and
Mhm.
innovate. And just the funny example of before kale was really known as a superfood, Pizza
Mhm.
Hut was the number one buyer of kale, and they used it for the displays for their pizza buffet. So you took a food product that, well, now we consider it a food product, and there's a lot of different varieties, but previously it didn't have that kind of diversity. That is disruptive and challenging to the agricultural kind of breeding system and complex in the way we do business today. Kind of the pace that we innovate, the pace that we change. And so it's always, yeah, you kind of go along with it. Like, boy, if consumers would just pick something and stay with it, that would really make our lives easier back here as the agricultural industry. But the more I think about it, it's we're thinking about this backward, changing consumer habits and trends, and more of a focus on nutrition and diversity of what they eat creates massive opportunities for the people that are willing to think differently and get it right. So instead of trying to say, we're going to produce similar products or we're going to try to tweak them just a little bit to make them just palatable enough or just different enough, for the consumer that they'll buy that, we need to think about how do you hit the holy grail of what the consumer wants? How do you deliver exactly what they want, get it to them quickly, make them part of the process,
Yep.
build the supply chain to make it happen instead of trying to fit everything new into the current system or the old system. Um, so that's, just in my mind, even though I kind of think about how can we innovate and be different as a
Mhm.
whole industry, I kind of bought into that same, boy, it's a challenge that consumers are changing their minds so quickly, or their preferences for improvements are different now than they used to be. That's the opportunity we need to take advantage of and figure out how to execute on.
Yeah, no, Jim, I agree with you. And part of it is we can't be reactive to just fads, right? Like we have to ensure that at the base of what we do, it's still nourishing the world rather than reacting to food as privilege rather than food as, kind of the core of society, which is what a lot of trends are. But you're right. And we talk a lot at ZeaKal about this idea of consumer empowerment, that if consumers felt like they were empowered with the choices that they were making and they were actually buying a product on parameters that were important for them, that were measurable, that were grounded in science, I think that's a long-term stickiness in terms of collaborating and empowering consumers to feel like they're part of the value chain rather than just being kind of a passive recipient of it. Um, but that really can't happen under our current value chain, like you said, if we are so opaque and fragmented and everyone finds their way to kind of race to the bottom, get it back into that kind of gray area of just every other commodity. We really can't empower consumers. And to be honest, I think that's why agriculture gets such a bad rap. I look at what people say about agriculture sustainability, agriculture as a factory system, no diversity, no nutrition. A lot of these just have no basis whatsoever in facts. However, what they do reflect is the fact that the consumer is very disengaged. And secondly, it's not very transparent. We don't do a very good job of empowering them. And so, on that note, for innovators that have this differentiation, that have a product that has consumer resonance, that has farmer margins, that kind of speaks to the entire value system, what do they need to do though to be competitive, to take away that fear from farmers? Because you're saying that, these guys, the establishment, the incumbents, they've done a really good job of maybe not creating the highest returns, but they've also taken away a lot of the downside, right? So there's something reliable and safe about seeing those brands and just knowing that you can rely on them. What are the things that a startup or a new disruptive player will have to reach in order to get a farmer comfortable with it? And how much of that is data? How much of that is marketing? How much of that is winning the hearts and not just the minds of growers?
Yeah, well, I think you really kind of cover a lot of ground there. And one thing I just want to bring back up is that consumers are trying to find as much information about what they're putting in their bodies as they possibly can, and they, as a group, they're frustrated that it's so hard to learn about what they're eating. And so I think partly because of that, they're more likely to fall for some of those fad marketing claims, and they're reading that label and not really understanding what's going on in that label, and just buying the thing that kind of looks the best to them.
Mhm.
And we could do a lot better as an industry of teaching consumers what nutritional value actually is, how to read ingredients, how to understand it, how to understand how that ingredient list actually impacts their body and improves their health and nutrition, and what we're doing throughout the entire supply chain to benefit consumers. And partly because ag is always seems to be at least always inward looking. Well, how do we kind of make our own system work better? How do we make it more efficient? How do we kind of keep it all one size fits all? Because any one off creates either a competitor could come in and take the one off opportunity, or that's going to take more capital because I've got to build different bin sizes, or I have to figure out a different way to transport this grain. um, the consumer sees that as you don't want to produce what I want to buy. You're trying to get me to buy something else. And so that disconnect there just really flows all the way from the consumer's inability to understand a label and really, you know, truly understand nutrition, to them then falling for some of these fad diet and fad marketing situations. So I think it's all interconnected. Specifically, when you're talking about the farmer side, it's making them an active participant in the whole process. And I think you can connect farmers and consumers in a way that builds trust, that puts them kind of at the table with the system, being a voice there. So they're not just consumers has to buy what's available. The farmer produces for, just a commodity product. Let's get the two what I think are the two most important pieces of the supply chain, the farmer and the consumer. Let's put them together. Let's innovate around them with them at the center of it so we can all create value for each other.
No, that's great, Jim. Compressing the supply chain, that's another theme that we're really passionate about. And I remember when we did the root of it with Paul, I asked him that specific question. I said, why can't ag be more like pharma? And not that, we want to produce pharmaceuticals, but, pharma has this dynamic innovation system. A lot of innovation capital comes in, serial entrepreneurs constantly trying to find the next great cure. And capital goes into it, and it's all about speed and size and everything, and change, and even disrupting yourself. That doesn't happen in ag. And Paul made the great point. He goes, a seed company has all those features, right? Like it has research, it's spending billions a year on new innovations, and it's constantly trying to create that, value added product, something that's different. But he's 4 or 5 steps away from the consumer, and he'll never sell to that consumer, unlike, the latest therapeutic, where we create it, it's a pill, and the consumer uses it and sees a benefit immediately. Our supply chain is that large, consolidated, but fragmented. And that's the biggest contradiction, is that you would think with this type of consolidation that it would be kind of more unified, that it would be easier to get the 12 players that really matter to say that we can do this, but everyone stays in their lanes. Is this a grassroots effort? Is this something that has to, again, work outside the system? Can we build that infrastructure separately? I mean, what do you see using, corn and soy, for example, as what farmers grow, as being able to build that new supply chain? What are the other pieces to truncate that even quicker or faster or more cost effectively?
Yeah, I think it does come from the outside because if you think about all the innovation that's come from kind of the large agricultural organizations, it's all around that same concept of the farmer buying corn to make into commercial grain. It's a lot of more efficient ways to do it, or maybe more convenient ways to do it with certain technologies. But and those are all great. But it's kind of like Apple making a smaller iPod.
Mhm.
Okay, so you've made an iPod. That's fantastic. I can listen to music, which is a little smaller than the cassette, a little bit better than the CD player because it doesn't skip. But you're still just making something to listen to music on. It's not really revolutionary because the farmer is still buying a product that he's going to turn into commodity grain. And so if you think about all the innovation along that line, is how differentiated really is the product the farmer's buying. There's been a lot of years and billions of dollars spent on incredible, technology using plants and innovating in a biological system, but we still don't have a different way of involving the farmer in agriculture. So, and I think that comes from that entrenchment and the need to be able to keep fueling that system, to reinvest in that system, and it just kind of perpetuates itself. I think that disruption comes from the outside and building products specifically with farmers in mind, using farmers as piece of the supply chain and integrating that more tightly.
So I think for all of us innovators, that are listening, we want to believe that our product, our innovation, is the one that is able to make that change, right? And that's why we're in this business, is to disrupt, to reinvent, and to kind of change the paradigm. Maybe focusing now at a more granular level with specific innovations. What innovation would you say um, was one that farmers were really looking forward to, the ones that they would just have loved to see in the market, but for whatever reason didn't end up making it? And conversely to that, what is one innovation where everything works as it was expected, but it just totally missed the mark in terms of what farmers actually need?
Well, the one that I was most excited about was the GMO traits for nitrogen use efficiency.
Mhm.
And I mean the benefits to a farmer, the benefits for the planet, for everything from water quality and just go down the line. If we could use less synthetic nitrogen and produce the same quantity of food for the planet, that is a huge win for everybody.
Mhm.
And even if the farmer didn't achieve a higher level of margin by having that product, they're less susceptible to rising fertilizer prices when commodity prices go up. I mean, that's one of the first responses to high commodity prices is higher fertilizer prices. It's also an environmental issue that could be solved by having it in the plant or a more efficient plant. So that was a lot of discussion about 10, 15 years ago, and it just never materialized. Um, so that would be fantastic. The one that I think played out the way people expected it to, but it just never delivered for the farmer. And maybe I'm not going to say the story is written on it because people are still really trying and working hard to make it work. But it's the whole concept of big data and precision farming. So what we know and what we can actually do and tell a farmer to do in the prescription that we can write is unbelievable. Probably works better than people originally thought 10, 15 years ago. But it's been hard to monetize that to the farmer and really give the farmer true value. So then the whole system has struggled to really fund those activities and pay for those activities. Uh, Partly because the farmer has to make a pretty big investment on equipment to be able to execute it. If you're going to do variable rate planting or multi-hybrid planting, if you're going to follow prescription of nutrient management or water management to this square foot level, you need equipment and technology can actually hardware that can make that happen. So the data piece, I think the industry has gone above and beyond its expectations. It's delivering that in a way where the farmer is benefiting, so the farmer is willing to pay money for it, I think has been really, really hard. And the book isn't closed, people are still working on it. But that's a challenge that I haven't seen many people overcome yet.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. And maybe one theme that came out of both of those, the what I wish I had and what I do have but may not need as much, is that the theme seems to be sustainability. How do we continue to minimize agriculture's footprint, if you will? And we're creating new markets around this right now. Carbon markets are coming to agriculture, and we've been talking about paying farmers for better practices. What is your view on this? Obviously, sustainability is going to be critical, not only for fighting climate change, but a sustainability focus on how we can climate proof agriculture. Because whether climate change exists because of man-made greenhouse gases, the reality is that as agriculture spreads and we're cultivating new acres and we're facing more volatile weather patterns and the level of productivity needs to meet a growing population, ag volatility is going to increase due to climate. So I think we can all agree on that, no matter which side of the issue you're on with climate change. So we had to start climate proofing crops, minimizing inputs, making sure that they perform under kind of more varied conditions. But we had to get farmers incentivized to start adopting those technologies. Otherwise, we all suffer from it from a macro standpoint. So this is one of those public good things that's really hard to price for when individual farmers are selling on dollars per bushel. What do you think about this whole new carbon market, this whole idea of sustainability, a climate market, getting farmers paid on it? Do you think it's possible? And if so, what do we need to watch out for to really make sure this becomes a reality?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a great topic. I truly do believe there are huge benefits there, and if we can kind of build a entire food production system that takes all of the impacts into consideration, and people are rewarded for following the best practices all the time, I think everything becomes more sustainable. Today, we only pay the farmer based on yield, only based on output, regardless of how they get there. And by and large, farmers are incredibly responsible with their land, with the resources, with their animals. They are very, very good stewards. But you can even improve that system more if you link all the rewards to the right pieces of that whole farm practice. My concern there is that this whole supply chain that exists around farmers does the same thing to carbon that it did to everything else. Is that all the intermediaries that sell the carbon credits to the companies, who broker all the deals, who conduct all the validation, who develop the technology, that they keep all of that margin for themselves and pass on very little to the farmer who's actually making that happen by managing their land differently. And so I'm excited about the prospects, but I also am a little bit worried that the farmer doesn't get the opportunity to benefit or participate at a level in this new market opportunity that I think they really should.
Jim, we need more transparency. It sounds like in all these issues, there's value in ag. We need to be more transparent about that value, and more importantly, we have to be able to share in it. Um, why is that so hard? It just sounds like it's a first grade lesson, right? Share what you have
Yeah.
and incentivize everyone on the supply chain. But even from a purely selfish, capitalistic, commercial standpoint, wouldn't that actually create the long-term relationships and the stickiness that we will want from growers so that they're committed to our innovations and our products? I mean, why is that such a hard concept in agriculture? Loyalty.
Yeah, I think it would be amazing. I mean, you could probably use blockchain to make this happen, but if you could have a product on the shelf or a carbon credit that a company buys, and then identify who made what all the way through, like how much did the farmer earn of this carbon credit that I as this company am buying, and really break it down so we can all see and we can all participate and all understand what that whole margin situation looks like. I think there'd be a lot of value in there. Of course, the reason transparency doesn't exist is because people who control the information want to keep as much of the margin as possible. I mean, that's true across everything. You know, if you don't look behind the curtain, you just trust me and I'll tell you what's going on back there, and I'll collect a fee for telling you what's happening. Even even within our business as a contract seed producer, when we're producing seed for companies, it's a full transparency model. We have a data management system called My Supply Live, where you would actually see a geo or a map of all the fields that we've planted for you. You know exactly where they are. We timestamp and geolocate every single field activity that we do in that field all year long. You see all that data in real time. We're not scrubbing the information. You're seeing it as it happens, and a lot of our clients really appreciate that. They can, it's that full transparency model, and that builds a lot of trust in the system. They know what we're doing. They know we're doing it on time, and that we're confident in sharing that information without having to go through a whole bunch of intermediary steps. And I think that transparency of the whole ag system would really build confidence from consumers. Farmers would feel, a bigger part of it than they do today, and it'd be a better system for everybody.
Jim, that's great. Well, we're coming up to the end of our session. It's been a great conversation with you. And again, just like every other root of it we do, these are conversations that happen, in our lives on a daily basis. And what ZeaKal really wants to do is to share these conversations with the industry and the community, because we really believe that that's what's going to foster the change that we need, and we all have to be participants in it. And for today's Innovating for Today's Grower session, I mean, my key takeaways were we need a better and more transparent value chain, one that works together with all participants sharing the value rather than trying to squeeze it. We need to make ag more local again. We are a global commodity business, but we need to do everything we can to create a truncated, more local supply chain that actually rewards farmers for the value that they create, to pay them on some dimension other than yield. And that sustainability is something that we're already working on today, but it's something that we really need to get monetized so that we can start incentivizing farmers to start adopting those best practices and be rewarded for them. Jim, do you have any other closing thoughts for our listeners today?
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. This has been a lot of fun. The system should work together. We should all be part of it. We're all working for the same goal,
Mhm.
and too often the the value is extracted by those who are at conflict with the system or put other pieces of the system at conflict with each other. They do that for their own benefit and at a disadvantage for the entire system. So I think anything you can do to help build a cohesive system where everybody's benefiting and participating and everybody's aware of how that's functioning, you have such a better chance to be successful long term and to incentivize the right practices and the right kind of behavior.
Perfect. Well, Jim, thank you again today. Really, really appreciate your time, all the wisdom that you've been able to share with the listeners today. For all our new listeners today, we hope you enjoyed the session. Please do visit the ZeaKal website if you missed some of our previous routes of it that we referenced in today's conversation as well. And Jim, thanks. We talked a lot about what we want to do. And if you want to also learn more about that, come look at the ZeaKal website for the new type agriculture system. Take care and have a great day, everyone.